Welcome back, everyone, to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We are the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church. Welcome to our 59th episode. And today we turn again to another story / parable on wealth, ? This is a controversial story about rich man and Lazarus. And in short, I'll borrow from my colleague Justin, mind the gap. Let's hear this text. Luke 16, verses 19 to 31. Jesus said, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in his manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Beside all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us.' He said, 'Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment.' Abraham replied, 'They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them.' He said, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent.' He said to them, 'If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I think this is Luke's big mic drop line, even if someone rises from the dead. There's nothing like a foreshadowing double meaning than a line like that.
Yeah, you're totally right. Oh my gosh.
Wow, what do you two have to
It's like he's breaking the fourth wall right there.
Right.
This conversation between Abraham and I can't resist calling the rich man Dives. Okay, so I'm full of Britishisms today. I got Mind the Gap and Dives and Lazarus is an English folk song. And I think Ray Vaughan Williams had some beautiful settings of it, variations on the tune and that kind of thing. But anyway, this conversation between Dives, the rich man, and Abraham, they're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then it's as though Abraham looks at the audience, breaks the fourth wall between the stage and the audience, and says, if they didn't listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced even if someone rises from the dead, right? Because the readers of Luke are going to know what's happened to Jesus, right? They're going to know this story. It's an incredibly dramatic moment. There's a lot of drama in this particular story / parable. I'm sure Father Peter here is going to have an opinion about whether this is a parable or not a parable. But in any case, in this parable / story / whatever, there's a lot going on. There is a lot of drama, and not just the breaking of the fourth wall at the end. What's always been driven home to me in this particular story is that Dives and Lazarus, the rich man and Lazarus, are separated in life by this gate, and they are separated by this chasm in the next life. And it's so the Book of Common Prayer. There's a prayer that prays for God to keep us outwardly in our bodies and inwardly in our souls, and I think it's as though our outward relationships are also at the very same time spiritual. And eschatologically, or in the life of the world to come, the story is that the division, the societal, the systemic, the economic wall, literal, the gate, in the wall, and figural. Everything that separates Lazarus's life from that of the rich man, there is going to be an eschatological chasm. There is a spiritual chasm, but it is invisible in this life. In the next life, once the trappings of this world are gone, it's perfectly visible. And the tables are turned, which is the great reversal from Luke, right? Luke has been forecasting this the whole time. Luke says, blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. Lo and behold, that's how it turns out, right?
Last shall be first. Yeah. Well, what an incredible story / parable this thing is. And I might just take us through just a few of the details, because the story gets better and better and better and better and better the more we look and look and look. So you couldn't have two people contrasted more in the chasm more. So we have rich man, poor man. The rich man is dressed in purple, which is, of course, points towards royal. And he feasted sumptuously. This is the Greek word here is where we get both glutton and gourmet. So it's likely that he was a gourmet glutton. He was on a roll, right? And at the gate, and then at the gate lay the poor man, and man, has this guy got it bad, right? He's got sores, nothing to satisfy his hunger. And then it says here, this is where translations just, they're really rough, kind of. The hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Okay, so let's talk about that. I mean, I used to have 5 little kids, and stuff did fall from the table, but that was spilt milk and stuff like that. And what? And the old one was the crumbs this was crumbs, and then I couldn't help but reach over. Sorry, while you were talking, saying great stuff, I reached over and grabbed the Book of Common Prayer.
The BCP's always better.
We do not presume to come to this thy table, O merciful Lord, trusting in thine own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table here. So what is the crumbs under thy table? Let's talk about that for a second. So as I understand it, and I have witnessed this, in the Middle East, when you eat, they don't have knives, forks, and spoons, or they so for instance, if there's a piece of meat, you carve the meat off. We used to have this with the Lost Boys, who are a part of my parish in Phoenix. You carve the meat off, and this same thing when Sam, my oldest son, lived in the Middle East, and he'd go to these tribal feasts in the desert, and they would have the slain animal, and they have the sharp knife and the animal with head, legs, and you just come up and you hack a piece off and you stick it in your mouth. And so they would have this on the table. You hack it off, and then you might eat. And the crumbs under your table, the bread works as a napkin. And so you would eat that, and then when you were done, you would wipe the grease off your hands and toss the bread on the floor. So these are the crumbs underneath thy table, is essentially the edible napkins that are left over. So, this is what he wants to have, is the napkins, the bread that has the meat of the animal in it. And then we get, he dies, and he's carried away by angels. So the poor people were not even buried in Jesus' day, right? They were thrown into the flames of the valley of Gehenna, where the flames burnt all the time. They would just toss the bodies on them. And then we hear that the rich man is buried, and probably buried well. And then, as you said, so where are these flames? Hades is Sheol in Hebrew. And he's tormented. And then it just says, Abraham is far away with Lazarus by his side. And again, are they standing side by side in line? What's going on here? It's not that at all. They're having the eschatological banquet, and these people ate lying down. Remember, so the old translation is at his bosom, and by that means he's got his head. They're all supine on a pillow, and he's got his head, he's lying right next to Lazarus, and in front of them is the feast, the table here. And then I'll just finish with this, because I could talk and use up about 45 minutes, sorry. So I won't do that, but I just can't help but send this one. This guy is a jerk. This rich guy is a jerk. He is a jerk. He is so dislikable. It's shocking how dislikable he is. I don't like this man. And one of the things I can't stand about this guy, send Lazarus.
Right.
He still thinks he's Lazarus's boss. He still thinks Lazarus is a lowly nobody. Send Lazarus. He still thinks he's got the privilege. And then later, when he comes down even further, he says, then Father, I beg you, send him to my father's house, right? If I can't get the water, send him to my brothers here. And so he still doesn't get it. He's still sending his, he gets it, but I think he's still a jerk even when he's dead. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I read that Jesus is using a really popular folktale that's found across several cultures and Egypt and that whole region, and he gives it this Jewish context.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And Father Abraham and Lazarus at the gate, and he's as we said last week, that story he was talking to the disciples directly. And we miss a little conjunction bit here where he's talking to Pharisees in this one. And he's really confrontational, as we know with the Pharisees. And I've read also that because I didn't know this already, but the Pharisees had a theology that they grounded firmly in Deuteronomy 28, where it's a sort of crystallizing passage where God will make all those prosper who are righteous, and the unrighteous will be cursed and all that. And they had a lot to justify this theology of prosperity, and they could draw on Proverbs. Those who love my law will have great wealth, and the wicked will, for them it is not so, and that kind of thing. And they had this real justification for their wealth and their love of wealth and their use of it as a sign of God's blessing, and conversely, God's curse on anyone who appeared to be destitute, or Lazarus at the gate was clearly someone God was punishing for something. So they had a reason to feel so self-righteous and blessed and on the side of righteousness. And so when I get down to him saying, he says, send Lazarus to my brothers. And Abraham says, if they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, then they should, but they won't believe anyone. And the man says, no, if someone goes to them, then from the dead, then they'll repent. Because he knows how ingrained this way of thinking is, maybe, that he knows this is generations of thinking, and they have every reason, because it's based on the scriptures that they pore over. But Jesus is like reversing all this, not reversing, he's reinterpreting, or he's offering to the Pharisees a better reading of their own law and prophets. And so the prophets are filled with admonitions to help the poor and the people on the margins, and save some from the fields for the gleaners who come along. And there's so much teaching about that Jesus draws on, but they've justified their perspective. So you can kind of, that's where the guy's a deplorable, hateable guy, but when you get into his mindset, it's like, but I've always thought this is how it was, how could this not be true? And in a way, he starts to feel sorry for the guy, because he's been sucked into this mindset. And I think we all know people in our lives who we feel are beating a drum of a certain belief system. In our polarized society, we all think the others are wrong, but we all think we know we're right, And maybe that's this guy, his whole life and his generation before that and before that and before that, they've all had this feeling about wealth and God's blessing, the favor, disfavor of God based on wealth and poverty.
That's an incredibly eye-opening interpretation here. I think everything that both of you said is true. I'm really very interested in the fact that this is Jesus as a rabbinic teacher upending this, this Deuteronomic theology of prosperity. And you're right, a lot of that is in Proverbs too. I have to say, I think it's all right, but I feel like this passage is, to use the Reformation era language, not the language in its Jewish or biblical sense. This is, or not in the language of the Hebrew Bible, but in the language of St. Paul and in the language of the Reformers, Luther and Calvin, who love Paul so much. This passage is law, not gospel for me. And law has a purpose, right? The law is important. It is important to know that one fails at being good, right? But it's not the gospel. Law is different from gospel. I'll just say, I think this passage is true. I think that our societal, the things which divide us societally, the unbelievable poverty in which huge swaths of the world live, right? Not to mention the unbelievable poverty in our own backyard, in our own country. That chasm between them and me, who lives in New Canaan, Connecticut, in a very comfortable house, who has an excellent retirement plan, right? The Episcopal Church has an excellent retirement plan for clergy. This is not an advertisement to become an Episcopal priest, right? But thanks be to God for the church pension group. And the church pension group was founded partly because clergy were retiring into poverty before the church pension group existed. So there's a story to be told there about poverty and wealth and so on. But anyway, I am not Lazarus. I'm not Lazarus. And I believe that there is a spiritual as well as a systemic, there is something in my body and something in my soul, as it were, that divides me from Lazarus. But I will just say, I'm ready for gospel. I'm ready for some gospel here too, and I think it's important to read this story in the context of the whole scriptures, the whole Gospel of Luke, the whole book of Acts, and the whole of the New Testament, the whole of the scriptures as a whole, the whole of the scriptures as a whole. How about that for a sentence? Because here's the deal. For me, I was raised conservative evangelical. Many people know this. I was raised Southern Baptist. I spent the first 20 years of my life feeling guilty mostly about sex, right? Lustful thoughts, and then I'm just going to leave the rest blank, right? Felt guilty about my sex life, to what extent it existed, and I felt guilty about playing too many video games instead of praying very often. I mean, I felt guilty about a lot of stuff, okay? I grew up with not the God that my parents taught me about. My whole life's mission has been to bring the God of my family, of my mom and my dad and my grandfather and my grandmother into and in competition with the theology I've been given by the church of my childhood, but I'm also going to say the church of mainline Protestantism, because I felt guilty for the first 20 years of my life about sex, etc. And I felt guilty for the last 13 years of my life about money, about privilege, about social and societal sin. So social and societal sin is a really important concept, okay? I think it is true. I do think that our societal arrangements do have spiritual consequences, and these consequences are catastrophic to our souls. That's absolutely true. The story is true. Everything that the two of you have said is true. But I have found mainline Protestantism, I found the Episcopal churches just like hammering away at what I would call social justice self-righteousness to make me feel just as guilty as I used to as a conservative evangelical. But now I'm just guilty about living in New Canaan, Connecticut. Now I'm just guilty about not having taken vows of poverty. Now I'm feeling guilty for social sin instead of for personal sin. And I wonder if the good news of the gospel isn't to pull out the rug from all of that and to say that, yep, there is a chasm, but as it says in the book of Ephesians, Christ is our peace, and in his flesh he has made both into one and has broken down the dividing wall that is the hostility between us. The good news is that, yep, social sin is real. It is as ineluctable and as inescapable as what we used to call original sin. Rahner, in particular, the great theologian, Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, drew a comparison between original sin, which is not chosen, right? It was Adam and Eve's fault, right? We didn't do anything. But we still suffer its effects and we suffer its consequences. He compared systemic sin to that and told a very famous story about buying a banana at a grocery store in a time when you had the existence of banana republics, right? An incredible global economic injustice. And he's like, I've just committed systemic sin by buying the banana at the grocery store. Just as ineluctable, just as inextricably inescapable as original sin. And the good news is that Christ conquered it. Christ conquered it. And when we get to heaven, there's going to be a cross which is erected across the chasm between me and Lazarus.
Whoa, that was smoking.
Can you tell I'm just over feeling bad about myself all the time? I really am. And we can be just as righteously about systemic sin as mainline Protestants, as conservative evangelicals are about sex. That's what I want to tell the world.
Well, I'm going to agree with you on all that. And I would say that having grown up a Catholic kid, the Catholics, Roman Catholics, we had our own dosage of guilt. And I remember my early years when, before we had kids, hanging out in New York City with good friends. One was a Reformed Jew, the other ones had formerly been an Orthodox Jew, trying to figure out who had more guilt to contend with. Was it the Jews or was it the Christians?
Oh my gosh.
And so I didn't grow up with people like you, with you guys. I just didn't. Your stripe was not so much in my town, and to hear you talk about that is fascinating. So you're responding to what you just said. I think we would almost have to respond with silence and an incredible deep breath in which there was a massive, massive, massive letting go before God, letting go of paradigms of our thoughts. I had a long conversation. Our dinner time conversation last night was about St. Francis, Buddha, and the question of kenosis and detachment. And then what it is that, then I was adding in, and then what would you attach to? And so the attachment to Christ and the detachment from a lot of our thought processes that cause us to cripple us. And Rob was behind the camera with the Justice It's Jesus Thing t-shirt, aiming to do his dissertation on the question of people who are creating spiritual community out of people who are hurt by church, hurt by theology. And so all that is an enormous, enormous and super tender topic, because we can mangle people for their lives with the things that, is an immense responsibility for people of our calling, because the people actually listen to us. I'm going to take that and just move it right back here for 1 second, and then I'm going to come back around the block here. First of all, when we started, I thought you were going to lead with the thing you always lead with. What's the major thing you taught me was to read the gospel, that you have to read the gospel with community in mind, and then these inequities. It was like your Brian McLaren liberation theology in the last one. Well, I think part of this is here. Money matters.
I didn't spill all my beans yet.
Oh, you're not done yet. I'm sorry. Okay. And the second thing, money does matter, and we can, because coming down the pike is Zacchaeus, who gives half of his stuff. And so Zacchaeus is actually Saint Zacchaeus, right? Zacchaeus is the guy who makes the adjustment. And so that's one. And then secondly, loved your commentary about the prosperity gospel. The Proverbs are the first business literature. That's literally the world's first business literature, the book of Proverbs, and how to contend with that. But let me just bring one more thing, and then I want to get to you, and sorry for my long-windedness, but which has to do with where do they land? Let's take a look at both sides of the chasm. I love your cross across the chasm. Is this heaven and hell? What is this? And so we know that coming down the line in Luke's gospel, the three guys being crucified, and how about the guys being crucified next to Jesus? They don't get enough. There should be churches named after the guy next to Jesus. The crucified next to Jesus says, Jesus, bring me into your kingdom, or and the other guy's like, hey man, get yourself down from the cross, dude, kind of thing. And Jesus says, you will be with me today in paradise. So is this paradise? Right? And is the other one Hades, Sheol, hell? The history of hell, a lot of stuff gets added on to Sheol and Hades through the tradition. So we have to even watch that whole word, because we lay on that, all that other thought pattern stuff. And then what does Jesus do with his death? Okay, And is it, the cross across the chasm? I feel like opening back up the book of Compare. And he descended into hell. And so right out of the book of Ephesians again, setting the captives free. And does Jesus's salvific move release the rich man who doesn't have a name. You gave him a bit of a name earlier, but so notice how like Lazarus is named, but the rich man's not named. But did they get released? So anyway, in the salvific economy, does Jesus, let him out of prison?
Well, it is a folktale. It is a story. It's a parable or a story. This isn't like, the curtain back on something that's actually transpired. Probably. It's right. Jesus is using it's a literary device and a teaching story. So I don't think that, I think it would be a mistake for a sermon to get caught up in, this is what happens 5 minutes after you die. You're going to either end up in one of these places and have this confrontation with Abraham, and so that's like.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Agony in the flames if you don't, you don't give more money when the plate goes around.
Right, and all that art.
Right, exactly. Agony in flames.
It's a folktale from an ancient culture, and Jesus is using it, in his culture. So, to do that is just, I think that's one of the modern mistakes of reading scripture is that we all have either grown up with or still exists in certain circles, but to be so literal that even the parables we think are literal stories of our fate. And, we really miss the richness. And in terms of, just to be clear, I did grow up with so much Pentecostal stuff, but only after I was about 12 or 13. And up until that point, I grew up in the Episcopal Church. And it was I bypassed a lot of that guilt that you had to grow up with, and I'm so sorry for that because it's a really terrible way to grow up, to just be guilty for everything. Somehow I separated whatever I was supposed to feel bad about from after 12 from church versus God, or this feeling I had that there was a God that really didn't necessarily go to the same church we did.
That's a great one.
But so that's, I feel lucky about that. But the liberation, I love that you brought in that Ephesians, that Jesus breaks down the dividing wall. That's such a perfect pair with this. Too bad it's not the lectionary passage for this week.
Yeah.
But I think that being freed from these guilty burdens of either sex or money or social sins, it doesn't remove the fact that they are sins, or I don't know about the sex stuff, but we have social sins that are just clear. The way we spoke last week about dishonest wealth of our economy, like it's in the mix. We live in this fallen world with our horrible ways, but to be freed from the guilt of it is to be freed to do something about it, and to do it with joy, not like a breastfeeding and beating other people for not doing their part, but to just see the absolute joy in the shortness of our life and the pleasure of sharing. If there's anything in Jesus' teaching about wealth, he's always saying there's an antidote. Generosity, there's an antidote. Just let go of all of it. And you can be inoculated against this disease of like anxiety over wealth and guilt over not doing it right or giving enough. Like, just be generous. Experience the joy. It's actually really fun and really life-giving to help someone in need. And what comes out of that is absolute, eternal qualities. So
Jesus is more blessed to give than receive.
And he says it constantly, and we just don't want to hear that. We're like, how much? 10%, 20%, but he's like, there's just this antidote, and he kind of buries it in the corner, and it's almost like the thing that will just inoculate the world against this disease of the love of money, and so that's where I feel like we get stuck in the literalisms and the fear. He's doing this cautionary tale But, you know, that's woven throughout every single one of Jesus's teachings on wealth is here's how not to suffer the same fate.
Yeah.
In the here and now, you know. So
You can get lost in the chasm.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that the chasm can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? There's a version of that social sin narrative where it becomes so sticky, you're just like, well, I guess it's just going to be what it's going to be. I'm just going to live in my sin. You're right. That's not the answer, right? The answer is that I think that in Christ, the chasm has been breached. And that means that in our own world, in our own lives, we can breach those chasms with great joy. Now, are we going to do so perfectly? No. Doing so perfectly isn't the point. The point is to live as joyfully and to live into the kingdom of God, which for the Gospel of Luke comes with Jesus, right? Is right here, right now. To live as much in the kingdom of God as we possibly can in a world like this with people like us. And we talked about this on the podcast before, but I loved Pope Francis's intervention in the whole deserving, undeserving poor distinction about giving to people who solicit you on the street. He just said, just give. Who cares what they end up spending it on, right? Because I remember as a college student at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, we were, I was at a campus ministry there, and we actually, some people came in to kind of coach us around how it would be most effective to work with housing insecure people who were living on the street and who were asking for money. And there was they suggested that send them to the shelter first. Suggested they get in touch with social services. They actually discouraged us from giving them money because they were like, well, actually that's going to keep them from coming to us for help, and we're the ones who can help the most. And there was wisdom there. I'm not saying that there wasn't wisdom there. I have great respect for the people who were, these people were really moving the needle in the fight against poverty in Knoxville. Incredible, incredible people. But Pope Francis is also right? So they're right, and Pope Francis is right. If you got something in your wallet, I just give it now. And I don't say that to brag about myself, because most of the time I don't carry any cash because I'm a millennial, right? So I'll just tell you, most of the time I don't have any money. But I do always strive to make eye contact because I'm trying to bridge the chasm. And this is going to become too self-congratulatory, which is the absolute opposite of the way that the absolute opposite of the point of this story. And so I'm just going to sketch it in very, very, very broad terms. I'll just say that Jewel and I, when we lived in East Rock, we met a man who, a man and his dog's name was, anyway, I'm not going to, again, it's going to become too self-congratulatory. I'll just say that these people were housing insecure. We became friends. And this friendship was really transformative for me and Jewel. Mm-hmm. And it was like the last time that I preached on this passage, I think I only preached at the old 5 o'clock service that we used to have here. And for some reason, I didn't preach at 8 and 10. I only preached at 5. And at 5, I just told that particular story because it was like for just a moment, the eschatological banquet where there's not a chasm. The chasm's been breached by Christ, actually bled into Jules in my life. It was really incredible. And I do pray, Lord, have mercy, Christ, have mercy, Lord, have mercy for our friend, too. Mm-hmm. Don't know where he is.
Wow, it's really beautiful.
I think that's a great story to tell, and there's no reason not to tell it. And if anything, it's a tale of making a relationship that too few of us really venture to do across all sorts of chasms, but it's a very life-giving. That's to my point. I think that when you put yourself out there, you let go of these things that we want to cling so tightly to. There's surprises of joy to be found. So, back to mind the gap. I think mend the gap. You could say
that's good.
Our ending point. So maybe mend the gap can be our takeaway from today's podcast. But thanks for joining us. We'll wind it up for today and see what comes out of the preacher's mouth this Sunday. And we invite you to like and share and subscribe to this podcast anywhere that you watch or listen. Have a great week and see you soon.